The year is 1741. The HMS Centurion has been at sea for 14 months. Of the 500 men who left Portsmouth, fewer than 200 are still alive. The ones who remain are not the strongest. They are not the bravest. They are the ones who, by accident or intuition, ate the right things. The cook on this voyage, a man whose name history never bothered to record, had been boiling a thick paste of dried peas, salt pork fat, and whatever citrus rinds he could find into a daily ration that smelled like a stable and tasted, by most accounts, like salted mud. It kept men standing. Nobody called him a genius. Nobody called it cuisine. The Admiralty called it adequate. What it actually was, a precisely calibrated set of nutritional interventions developed over 2 centuries of catastrophic failure, would take food scientists until the 1930s to fully understand. By number 12, you'll hear about the fermented shark paste that British officers tried to confiscate from Scandinavian sailors and couldn't because the sailors rioted. By number 6, you'll learn about the shipboard cheese that a Virginia court ruled in 1887 was technically a controlled substance. And by the time we reach number 1, you may have to reconsider everything you think you know about who the real pioneers of modern nutrition actually were. The ships were floating laboratories. The men were the experiments. What they discovered, through suffering, through death, through the stubborn ingenuity of people who had no other options, was later bottled, branded, and sold back to the world as modern health food. The cooks never got the credit. They rarely do. Food number 20, portable soup. In 1756, the British Navy issued a directive that every ship of the line would carry portable soup, a substance that looked like a dark brown hockey puck, smelled faintly of rendered cattle, and could survive 2 years in a ship's hold without spoiling. To make it, cooks boiled bones, offal, and vegetable scraps for hours, skimmed the fat, reduced the liquid to a thick jelly, then dried it into slabs. Each 2-ounce cake, dissolved in hot water, produced a passable broth. A sailor issued portable soup on the lower decks of a ship off the Cape of Good Hope in 1762, would have turned it over in his hands, scraped a bit with his thumbnail, and felt the slight tackiness that told him the glue-like collagen was still intact. The technique was deliberate. Long, slow boiling at low heat extracted gelatin from connective tissue, the same process modern restaurants call making stock. What the Navy understood practically was that this collagen broth maintained a sick sailor's gut function during extended voyages, reducing the intestinal atrophy that killed men faster than battles did. Naval surgeons noted in their logs that men who ate portable soup regularly during long passages suffered fewer digestive crises, though they couldn't explain why. Food number 19, Salmagundi. Before a long voyage left port in the early 1700s, the cook prepared Salmagundi, a composed salad of pickled herring, anchovies, hard-boiled eggs, whatever fresh vegetables were available dockside, oil, vinegar, and sometimes pickled grapes or capers if the ship was well provisioned. It was served in layers, dressed at the table, and eaten communally from a wide, shallow dish. The name likely came from the French Salmagondis, a mix of various ingredients, and it appeared in naval cookbooks as early as 1690. Salmagundi was deliberately made at port, not at sea. Cooks understood that the ingredients, fresh greens, raw eggs, oil that hadn't yet gone rancid, wouldn't survive the first week. So they front-loaded the voyage with nutrients, giving men one final concentrated dose of vitamins and minerals before the long slide into preserved food. The anchovies and pickled herring provided iodine. The eggs provided choline. The oil provided fat-soluble vitamins. Nobody called it a nutrient protocol. They called it a send-off meal. Food number 18, Burgu. Burgu was the daily ration on British naval vessels throughout most of the 17th and 18th centuries, and it is best described as oatmeal that had given up on being oatmeal. It was made by boiling oats, or whatever grain was available and hadn't yet gone weevily, in water or watered-down beer, then adding whatever fat was on hand. Drippings, lard, the skimmings off the salt pork pot. It was thick, gray, and eaten in the pre-dawn dark of the lower gun deck, standing up in under 4 minutes. The cooks who made Burgu understood something the officers eating in their cabins didn't. The slower you cook oats, the more of the soluble fiber survives. Long, slow-cooked Burgu, done right, kept a man full for 6 to 8 hours of hard labor, hauling lines, working the pumps, climbing rigging in wet cold. The beta-glucan in oats, which modern nutritionists now credit with blood sugar regulation, was doing exactly that work in 1720 without a name or a study to justify it. Food, number 17, Lobscouse. In the dockside neighborhoods of Liverpool in the 1840s, you could tell a sailor's wife by the smell coming from her window. Salt meat, potatoes, onions, and hard-dried ship's biscuit, all simmered together into a thick hash called Lobscouse. The dish traveled back and forth across the Atlantic in sailors' sea chests, fed families when the men were home and fueled the men when they were at sea. A Liverpool cook named it, gave it her own proportions, and passed the recipe sideways through the neighborhood women, who all cooked the same thing. The technique was straightforward and brilliant. The ship's biscuit, hardtack that had already been baked twice to remove all moisture, was crumbled into the stew at the end of cooking. As it absorbed the broth, it thickened the dish and stretched the meat across more servings. What could not be chewed as a biscuit became edible as part of a stew. Nothing was wasted. The salt from the preserved meat seasoned the whole pot. No additional salt was needed or could be afforded. Food number 16, dried stockfish. A sailor working a Norwegian cod boat in the Lofoten Islands in 1890 would have eaten stockfish, cod split, cleaned and dried on wooden racks in the freezing coastal wind for 3 months, until it was as hard as a plank and about as pleasant to handle. A single dried fish weighed perhaps 2 pounds. The same fish, reconstituted, fed 4 men. It kept without salt, without refrigeration, and without any technology at all for 3 to 4 years if kept dry. The drying process concentrated everything: the protein, the B vitamins, the omega-3 fatty acids. 100 grams of stockfish contain nearly 80 grams of protein, roughly double what fresh cod contains. The drying also partially broke down the muscle fibers through enzymatic action, making the protein more bioavailable once rehydrated. The Norwegians didn't know the biochemistry. They knew that men who ate stockfish through the winter didn't get as sick as men who didn't. Food number 15, peas pudding. Take dried split peas. Tie them in a cloth. Boil them in the same pot as the salt pork for 4 hours. Untie the cloth. Turn the gray, grainy mass onto a board. Cut it into slices. This was peas pudding, and it was the primary protein supplement for sailors across the British, Dutch, and American fleets from roughly 1620 to 1880. The technique of boiling in a cloth, a pudding cloth, was practical genius. It allowed the peas to cook in the broth of the salt pork without dissolving into it, absorbing flavor while retaining form. The salt pork gave the peas flavor and fat. The peas gave the meal substance and fiber. Together they made a complete protein, the amino acids in peas and pork complementing each other in ways that neither provided alone. Sailors eating peas pudding alongside salt pork were, without knowing it, performing exactly the protein pairing that nutritional scientists would codify in the 1970s. At this point, what becomes clear is not the desperation, but the precision. These were not men eating random things to survive. They were working within a system, flawed, cruel, often deadly. but a system that had been refined over 200 years of catastrophic failure. Every scurvy outbreak was a data point. Every fever epidemic taught something about fermentation and salt. The cooks who survived the longest passages, who kept the most men alive, were not the ones with the best ingredients. They were the ones who understood the ingredients they had. Modern nutrition science has spent the last century proving, one study at a time, that they were right. It has spent almost no time crediting them for it. Food number 14. Duff. On a British naval vessel in 1830, Duff was the treat. It came once a week on Sundays, and it was made by the ship's cook mixing flour, water, and whatever fat was available, usually the drippings skimmed from the salt pork kettle, into a stiff dough, then boiling it in a pudding cloth for 2 hours until it emerged as a dense, pale sphere that tasted faintly of pork and mostly of warm bread. Men who ate nothing but salt pork and hardtack for 6 days looked at their Sunday duff with something close to reverence. The technique was the same as peas pudding, boiling in cloth, but the result was carbohydrate rather than protein. Duff existed to address something the British Navy never formally acknowledged: caloric monotony. Men working 14-hour physical labor days in cold weather needed more than protein and vitamin C. They needed the particular psychological satisfaction of something that felt like food from home. Duff was a psychological intervention disguised as a flour dumpling. Food number 13. Sauerkraut. Captain James Cook loaded 7,860 pounds of sauerkraut onto the HMS Resolution before departing on his second voyage in 1772. He served it first only to the officers, deliberately, knowing the crew would refuse it. Within 2 weeks, when the crew saw the officers eating it regularly and not dying, they asked for it themselves. Cook reported in his log that he had trouble keeping them out of it. Not a single man on that voyage died of scurvy. Cook sailed for 3 years. The sauerkraut worked because the lacto-fermentation process that preserved the cabbage also produced vitamin C at levels that fresh cabbage doesn't achieve, and preserved it at those levels for months in a sealed barrel, which fresh citrus could not match. The lactic acid bacteria that drove fermentation also populated the sailors' guts in ways that their preserved meat diet otherwise destroyed. Cook didn't know any of this. He knew that Dutch traders who carried sauerkraut came back, healthier than English sailors who didn't, and he acted on the evidence. Food number 12. Hakarl past. Scandinavian sailors in the North Atlantic carried fermented Greenlandic shark, Hakarl, as a preserved protein source through at least the 17th century, sometimes in paste form mixed with fat for easier storage and distribution. The shark had to be fermented because fresh Greenlandic shark meat is toxic, containing high concentrations of trimethylamine oxide that the fermentation process converts into harmless ammonia compounds. The sailors understood this empirically. Eat the fresh shark and you get violently ill. Eat the fermented paste and you survive the winter. British naval officers on joint operations with Scandinavian vessels in the 1680s tried, on at least 2 documented occasions, to confiscate and dispose of Hakarl stores on the grounds that the smell indicated spoilage and the substance posed a health risk. The Scandinavian sailors refused both times. The first incident ended with a formal complaint to the Danish Admiralty, the Sul. Second ended with a British officer being pushed, accounts differ on whether accidentally, into the hold. Food number 11. Spruce beer. By 1760, British naval surgeons had identified a rough correlation between scurvy rates and access to fresh vegetation. Without understanding the vitamin C mechanism, their answer was spruce beer, a fermented beverage made by boiling young spruce tips in water, adding molasses, and letting the mixture ferment for 4 to 5 days in barrels. The resulting beer was low in alcohol, slightly bitter, and lightly carbonated. It tasted approximately like pine resin dissolved in weak ale. The spruce tips contained significant vitamin C. The fermentation preserved enough of it to matter. Surgeons aboard ships provisioning in Nova Scotia and Newfoundland in the 1760s began forcing regular spruce beer rations on crews who objected loudly and often successfully evaded it. The surgeons were correct. The crews were wrong. When spruce beer was consistently issued, scurvy cases dropped. The mechanism wouldn't be understood for another 170 years. There is a pattern in what gets remembered and what gets lost. The officers' meals, the preserved claret, the officers' cheese, the captain's private stock of spices are documented in naval records, in letters home, in published memoirs. The lower deck's food survives only in complaints, in health logs, in the terse accounting of the purser's books. We know what killed them. We know what kept them alive because it was anomalous enough to note. The daily genius of the cook who stretched 2 pounds of salt pork into a meal for 40 men, that's gone. We have only the outline of the knowledge, not the knowledge itself. That is always the shape of loss when the poor are involved. Food number 10, portable vinegar. Vinegar was issued as a standard naval ration from the late 1600s onward, and for most of that period it was understood primarily as a cleaning agent. Decks were scrubbed with it, wounds were treated with it, infected water barrels were rinsed with it. What the Navy didn't formally acknowledge was that sailors were drinking it daily, in small amounts mixed with their water ration. They were right to. The acetic acid in vinegar lowers the glycemic impact of the hard bread and dried grain that constituted most of the sailors' diet, preventing the blood sugar spikes and crashes that contributed to fatigue. It also has a mild antibacterial effect in the gut, reducing the diarrheal illness that killed nearly as many sailors as scurvy. The sailors who drank their vinegar ration rather than using it to scrub the decks were, accidentally, empirically, managing their metabolic health. Food number 9, flummery. In the 1740s, if you were a sailor who had been at sea long enough to have used up the good provisions and hadn't yet started the truly bad ones, and if the cook was skilled and hadn't yet given up, you might receive flummery, a thick, gelatinous pudding made by soaking oats or wheat bran in cold water for 2 days, then straining off the liquid and cooking it slowly until it set. It was eaten cold, sliced from a mold, with whatever sweetener was available. Molasses, if you were lucky. Nothing, if you weren't. The overnight soaking did something important. It activated phytase, an enzyme in the grain that breaks down phytic acid, the compound that prevents mineral absorption. Flummery, made the traditional way with a long cold soak, allowed the body to absorb iron and zinc from the oats at 2 to 3 times the rate of oats that hadn't been soaked. The cook who insisted on the 2-day soak wasn't being fussy. She, and many of the people who carried this recipe were women, cooks' wives who taught the men before voyages, was solving a mineral deficiency without knowing the biochemistry. Food number 8, salt horse. Among sailors, salt horse was both a ration and a running joke. It was preserved beef, packed in brine so strong that the meat had to be soaked in buckets of seawater for 24 hours before it could be eaten without causing immediate salt poisoning. It was hard as wood, gray-brown in color, and smelled of brine and the oak barrels it had lived in for anywhere from 6 months to, in some documented cases, 2 years. The joke was that it tasted like horse. The darker joke was that sometimes it might have been. What is not a joke? The sailors who ate salt horse regularly, despite its reputation, had higher rates of survival on long voyages than those who avoided it and subsisted on hardtack and dried peas alone. The collagen from the connective tissue that survived brining provided gut lining support. The high salt content, while extreme, provided essential electrolytes that sailors sweating through hard physical labor in all weather were losing in dangerous quantities. The technique of long brining in oak barrels also created mild fermentation byproducts that had weak antimicrobial effects on the gut. Food. Number 7. Ship's biscuit porridge. Hardtack ship's biscuit was the foundational caloric unit of naval provisioning from the 1400s through the late 1800s. Flour, water, and sometimes salt, baked twice until it achieved a hardness that made it inedible by most conventional methods. Sailors who broke teeth on it were not unusual. What is less documented is what happened to that biscuit when it was deliberately destroyed. Cooks on better-run ships, and some worse-run ones, saved broken biscuit, soaked it overnight in water or weak broth, then cooked it into a porridge. This was not a formal ration. It was not in the provisioning manuals. It was something cooks did because they understood that biscuit too far gone to eat whole could still be turned into something sustaining. The soaking activated some of the same enzymatic processes as the flummery preparation. The cooking broke down the wheat proteins into more bioavailable forms. It was, nutritionally, superior to eating the intact biscuit. Food number 6. Marine cheese. The cheese issued to sailors by the British Navy from roughly 1680 to 1850 was not, by any modern standard, cheese. It was a hard, aged block, typically a low-grade cheddar variant pressed extremely dry, that had been aged for a minimum of 12 months before issue, and often considerably longer, to the point where it had developed a rind-like bark and an interior that could be grated with a nail. It was issued in 1-ounce portions. Sailors called it by various names in various logs. Marine cheese was the naval designation. In the West India trade, issued cheese had been documented as more than 4 years old. The Virginia Admiralty Court ruled in 1887 that a shipment of naval cheese returned from a 2-year voyage and reissued for a 3rd voyage had by that point exceeded the legal definition of food and approached the legal definition of a building material. The ruling is real. The cheese was real. Sailors ate it anyway because there was nothing else. The nutrition science that has vindicated these foods, the omega-3 research, the probiotic studies, the work on fermentation and gut health, mostly emerged in the 1970s and 1980s, nearly a century after the foods themselves had disappeared from practice. By the time the science arrived to explain why they worked, nobody was making them anymore. The grandmothers who knew how to do it properly had died without students. What remained was the concept without the craft. The idea that fermented food was good for without the specific knowledge of how to ferment the right things in the right ways, in the right conditions. That gap between the science and the practice is where the loss actually lives. Food number 5. Twice cooked pork fat. On Dutch East India Company ships in the early 1600s, the ship's cook maintained a system for managing rendered fat that has no formal culinary name, but appears consistently in provisioning logs as the fat account. Every scrap of fat from the salt pork rations, the trimmings, the skimmings, the rendered drippings, was collected, clarified by heating, and stored in sealed crocks that lived in the cook's domain. This fat was the currency of the galley. It was used to waterproof boots, to grease the gun carriages, to prevent rope from fraying, and to cook everything that required cooking. But it was also eaten. Spread on hardtack in small amounts, added to the morning burgu, mixed into peas pudding. Sailors who received regular fat rations had lower rates of the night blindness that plagued long voyage crews, a symptom of vitamin A deficiency, which fat-soluble vitamins could address, and a pure lean protein diet could not. The cook who maintained the fat account was, without knowing it, managing the fat-soluble vitamin supply for 40 men. Food number 4, Rumford soup. In the 1790s, Benjamin Thompson, Count Rumford, designed what he called the Rumford soup as a feeding protocol for soldiers and sailors. A thick broth of pearl barley, dried peas, potatoes, vinegar, salt, and water. Cooked very slowly for 4 to 5 hours until the starch had broken down into the broth, creating a liquid that was technically thin but calorically dense. He published the recipe in 1795 with exact proportions, exact cooking times, and exact cost calculations. 1 penny per serving at London 1795 prices. What Rumford understood, and documented unlike almost everyone else on this list, was that slow cooking at low heat broke down starches in ways that fast cooking at high heat did not, creating more digestible, slower absorbing carbohydrates. He was describing the glycemic index before it had a name. He also understood that the psychological satiety of a hot liquid meal, the warmth, the volume, the act of drinking, had physiological effects on hunger suppression that the same calories consumed cold or solid did not achieve. Food number 3, vinegar brined onions. In the 1850s, American whaling ships out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, carried barrels of small onions pickled in vinegar brine as part of their standard provisions. This was not officially recognized as anything other than a condiment. The provisioning manifests list them under stores rather than rations. But whaling voyages lasted 3 to 4 years, and the captains who survived with intact crews knew something about those onion barrels. Onions are one of the richest dietary sources of quercetin, an anti-inflammatory compound that supports vascular health and, critically, reduces the joint deterioration that comes from months of working in cold, wet conditions. The acetic acid in the vinegar brine preserved the quercetin through the pickling process. Sailors who ate the pickled onions regularly throughout the voyage maintained joint function that allowed them to keep working in the rigging. Sailors on ships that didn't carry them began showing swollen joints and reduced grip strength after about 18 months. That was not scurvy, not rickets, but something the ship's surgeons of the period couldn't name. Food number 2, dandelion and seaweed greens. Ships' captains who made landfall at any habitable coast before the age of easy reprovisioning did something their provisioning manuals didn't include. They sent men ashore to collect greens. Any greens. Dandelion, sorrel, wild garlic, watercress, and, along coastlines, seaweed, particularly the kelp and dulse varieties that northern European sailors had known about for centuries. The men who came back with full sacks were sometimes formally thanked in ship's logs. More often, they were invisible. The nutritional profile of wild dandelion greens is genuinely remarkable, higher in calcium, iron, and potassium than almost any cultivated vegetable, and with vitamin A content that rivals liver. Dulse seaweed contains iodine at concentrations that prevented the thyroid dysfunction that sailors on purely preserved food diets regularly developed. The men gathering it didn't know about thyroid function. They knew that when they ate fresh greens, people stopped dying from the specific slow deterioration, the fatigue, the weakness, the mental fog. That wasn't scurvy but resembled it. Food number 1, the cook's discretionary pot. There is no formal name for this. It appears in no provisioning manual, no naval regulation, no official recipe, but it appears, obliquely, in the health logs of nearly every well-run British, American, and Dutch naval vessel from 1650 to 1850. A reference to the cook's judgment, the cook's additions, the cook's adjustments to the official ration. The official ration was designed by administrators who did not sail. The discretionary pot was managed by a man, always a man on naval vessels, though his teachers were often women, who understood through experience, observation, and inherited knowledge that the official ration was not enough. He added the small things: a handful of foraged greens from the last landfall, a piece of ginger root kept personally, not on the manifest, a few dried herbs pressed between the pages of no book that has survived, the fat skimmings carefully kept, the vinegar offered to men who didn't want it, the biscuit broken and soaked and made into something that could be swallowed. He was never mentioned in the captain's log unless something went wrong. When men stayed healthy, the credit went to the officer's management, the surgeon's vigilance, God's mercy. When men got sick, the cook was sometimes blamed. What he actually was, on every voyage where the sick rolls stayed low, was the ship's nutritionist, its fermentation specialist, its gut health practitioner, its food scientist, working with a tin pot and 40 minutes in the morning on a vessel that might be going down in the afternoon. The knowledge he carried was not written in books because it was not considered worth writing. It was practical knowledge, held in hands and in memory, passed between cooks in dock towns and port taverns and the below-decks kitchens of ships at rest. When the last of those men retired and the industrialized naval provisioning system took over, entirely in the 1860s, the knowledge went with them, not into archives, not into manuals, just gone, into the water, the way most things that belong to ordinary people go. If your family has a cook who knows things that seem strange and unnecessary, who insists on the 2-day soak, who saves the bones, who adds the thing you can't identify to the thing you've eaten 100 times, ask them, write it down. Don't wait for them to be celebrated. They won't be. They never are. Tell us in the comments, which of these would you actually try? And if your family still makes something from scratch that nobody else around you makes anymore, we want to hear about it. That recipe is worth more than you think.